Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. We're episode, I think, number 111. And James, you were last on potentially in the teens or the single digits 2 years ago in July. So it's good to have you back on. Appreciate it. Welcome on.
Thank you, mate. Yeah, we were saying it feels a bit ridiculous that it was nearly 2 years ago since we were last talking on here. But yeah, it's gone very fast.
Yeah, it has. And at that time, you were with GB or Great Britain Taekwondo. So maybe give the listeners just a brief background of what you were doing and kind of what you're doing now, and then we'll dive into a few bits and pieces.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose, last time we spoke, I think I was either just finishing up or either just finished, like near enough makes no difference. But with the GB Taekwondo Olympic team. So I was based with them from 2018 to 2022. So I basically did almost the Rio to Tokyo Olympic cycle with them. And then in sort of early 2022, I left them and basically stepped into the private sector, along with a little bit of work that I continue to do in professional sport with British Triathlon. But my main role now is, working in the private sector with combat sport athletes, essentially, whether that be in a one-to-one capacity or online, but primarily with MMA fighters and boxers seems to be the sort of niche that I've stumbled into now. So yeah, it's been going well. I've definitely, I think, going from pro sport to the private sector was a steep learning curve at the start, for sure. But it's been good. It's been a really good kind of 2 years in the private sector. Things have gone well.
Nice. Yeah, it's a good little transition as well, and you get to do things on your own without someone else telling you what to do, and we just sit through different meetings. Oh, dude,
for sure. And I was pretty lucky that when I decided I was going to leave Taekwondo, then just I think it's in my last week there was a job 2 days a week come up with British Triathlon, and I was like, well, that might be a nice little safety net just in case things don't go right in the private sector. So I ended up taking that. And yeah, since then, balanced that 2 days a week, but mainly, I'd say the remaining 3 days a week, but anyone in the private sector knows you're pretty much full time the rest of the week. So the other 5 days a week is the private sector work with the fighters.
Yeah, there's definitely a few things that I miss, and I'm sure you miss about working in professional sport, having the same athletes all the time, the same team, you're always together. But then there's things that the negatives just so far outweigh the positives in certain aspects, like dealing with certain coaches, the meetings, like the politics that goes on, the pay, like it's crazy, man. But when you're at the tournaments or at the competitions and you're winning and you win things, dude, that feeling, there's nothing better than that feeling.
Yeah, and I think that's, like, you've summarized it really well there from my perspective, which I think if I reflect back on it and someone said to me right now, right, private sector or pro sport, like, where are you, or what would you rather do? I'm private sector for many of the positives that gives. Like, I think from my experience, there's so many more positives to that private sector, but the positives of pro sport are the big things that kind of me playing rugby growing up and being involved in team sports, like being a little bit now removed from the team slightly in the private sector. I do miss it. Like, there are certain elements of just being part of a big team, seeing the same group of athletes in the gym day in, day out.
All working to the same thing.
Yeah, coaching big group sessions as opposed to one-to-one. There's some, and don't get me wrong, I love the one-to-one stuff, but yeah, there's just some aspects that you can never probably have the best of both worlds, I don't think.
No.
That job doesn't exist, I don't believe. But yeah, there are. Or maybe it does, and I need to keep my eyes out for it. But yeah, private sector all day, every day. But some of the big pros of professional sport I miss 100%.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a good way to get this podcast going is, it's been a couple of years, and you kind of last time we talked, you just shifted out of GB Taekwondo. So we're interested to know, has your training philosophy, or maybe the way you train your current fighters, has anything changed since maybe back then in terms of what you're doing, or I guess has anything really changed at all within the training philosophy?
I'd say majority no. I think a lot of my training philosophy is very similar, but I think a lot of that stems through kind of coming through the EIS, now UKSI kind of pathway for a long while. I think I suppose, almost like develop into a certain characteristic of practitioner. And that's definitely carried with me into the private sector. But I think one of the big things that I always felt I was a bit clear on before, but now more so than ever is probably just around clarity of purpose, or like clarity of adaptation and what we're trying to get within the training sessions. I think I'm probably much more anal with that now than I ever have been before. And I think a lot of that stems from now being in the private sector. In GB Taekwondo, although there'd be times that we didn't control things in the schedule, but we could have conversations with coaches and influence things. And I'd see the athletes 5-6 days a week and have conversations with them about all elements of what they're doing. And you could speak to all the practitioners around them. Suddenly, I don't have that. Like, I think the guys that I see the most, I see twice a week for an hour. And anytime I'm talking to coaches, it's probably through either very quick face-to-face meetings or WhatsApp messages. So I've kind of, I think, developed this approach now where I need to be super critical and super confident of what my program is giving that athlete, and only really deliver that. I think I'm just a bit more probably thorough with my programming because I'm aware that I have not less influence on the rest of the program, but I'm able to have less conversations around what's going on elsewhere and able to influence less things. So I need to be much more directed in what I'm doing.
So what are some of these adaptations then that you're now really dialing in on?
Yeah, I think I did about 6 to 12 months ago. I did an internship a mentorship with Chris Beardsley, because one of the things that I wanted to be, really crystal clear on was things along. We always talk about being like adaptation-led when it comes to programming, but actually really fundamentally understanding, like, if we are trying to develop strength, what are the physiological changes that we actually need to elicit to do that? And then what are the characteristics from the exercises we need to do to achieve that? So I think diving into things like understanding if we are trying to develop tendon stiffness, that really the loads that we need to have to elicit that, and if we go above a certain point, somewhere in that like 8 to 10 RM, we're probably not going to develop that tendon stiffness within strength training. If we're looking to try and develop, particularly with fighters, like if we're trying to develop power, then we need to be having exercises in the program that are very simple to perform, have minimal fatigue, and can allow the athlete to really generate a high level of motor unit recruitment. So there's that for me, the mentorship I did with Chris was really, really influential, because anyone who kind of follows Chris or looks at any of his work knows he's kind of a no-nonsense guy. And I think that really helped me be more critical with understanding at certain times what this athlete needs from this training program, and just being really critical as to, are the exercises that I put into this program actually going to help elicit that? And if not, then it might look nice and it might flow nice, but it's got to go.
Chris, did he write Strength is Specific? Was that his book?
Yeah, so he wrote Strength is Specific.
That was a great book.
He has a Patreon account as well, which I've been a member of for a little while, and he puts loads of his research up there. But yeah, he does a mentorship it's like 3 months long, and you have every week you basically have a call with him where he kind of blows your mind and gives you loads of reading to do for an hour. But, for me personally, it was probably the right thing I needed at the right time, and really influenced my approach.
Nice. Yeah, if anyone's interested in, if you just search Strength is Specific, Chris Beardsley, I think on Amazon, I think that book was like $1. I don't know if it's still $1.
It's about £2 or something.
Yeah,
it's ridiculous, but it is.
It's so good.
I think as coaches, when we talk about being adaptation-led, that book for me and a lot of Chris's work it's kind of a non-negotiable of stuff that I think we need to understand as coaches.
Yeah, that's heavily influenced a lot of my stuff too, around I guess high velocity strength training versus maximal strength training, and kind of seeing the differences in what you're trying to achieve and things. Yeah, highly recommend if anyone listening to definitely check that book out as well. I'll try to throw it, if I remember, I'll throw it in the description when this goes up with the recording. I might not remember, but either way, you guys can search it there as well. So you obviously mentioned about, for example, developing power. You're looking for something that's simple, easy to perform. Does that mean Olympic lifts are typically not part of that? Are you doing more loaded jumps and things like that?
Yeah, so my kind of thing with Olympic lifts with the cohort that I work with is, I think if I was to have a fighter or an athlete come to me, either having done a big bout of them previously, so had a reasonable understanding of them, or was quite young, probably more developmental athlete, it's probably something that I would utilize. But the vast majority of fighters that I work with one-to-one at the minute are all professionals. They're either professional MMA guys, they're professional boxers, and
You got some people with some big followings too, right? Along with that.
I've been pretty lucky. Like a few of the guys that I've worked with, like Lerone Murphy in the UFC. I've done a few camps with him. Brendan Loughnane, PFL world champion in 2022. Did a few of his camps when he was in the UK. Most recently, Lawrence Okoli, who's just won the Bridgeweight belt out in Poland. Worked with Lawrence. So there's a few other like relatively high-profile boxers and MMA guys, and also some guys that are coming through now as well. So I'm really fortunate that pretty much everyone I work with in my private sector, one-to-one anyway, is a professional MMA fighter or professional boxer. And that really influences what I do, because the way that I kind of think about it is these guys aren't amateurs where this is about building experience before turning pro. Like every fight for these guys matters, I should say. And that's kind of then where I come back to with Olympic lifts, which is, if I go back to that initial point I said about being really adaptation-led in my programming and being really crystal clear on what I'm trying to achieve and why, I always struggle to come back to this point of, and this is just my kind of belief, but have I got the time to dedicate to this to almost like not get a physiological change right now, but maybe in 12, 18, 2 years time, then utilize it?
Mm-hmm.
Probably not. And that's just my opinion. So I don't really utilize a lot of Olympic lifts, but a lot of my main thing for the development of power really is a lot of like heavy strength based work, and then a lot of relatively lightly loaded, whether if it's like med ball throws, bodyweight jumps, plyometrics. I will do some loaded jumps with some of my MMA guys, but I tend to almost take this polarized approach of, you know, it's either your heavy strength work or it's your much higher velocity jumps, throws, and very little in the middle, unless you probably already have a high level of strength or a high, almost like ability to express power and move at a very high velocity already. If you have those two things, I'll probably do some loaded jumps and things with you. But if not, I'm probably going to focus on those two things first.
Yeah, it's funny because you see some videos every now and then of maybe fighters or athletes doing heavier loaded jumps, or even just kind of Olympic lifts, and you watch it, and because they don't have that training underneath them, or they aren't as well skilled in the Olympic lifts, the movement's really slow. It's not snappy, and it's kind of like, you know, at that point, is it worth doing? As you mentioned, for your guys, no, because they have camp, like fight. Maybe for developmental fighter, potentially it might be worth learning. But as you mentioned, like, you know, if the intent's not there in the lift, you know, why do it? Because you're not going to get what you want out of it.
Precisely. And one thing that, going back to, again, I'll probably talk about it a little bit on the podcast, but going back to some of the stuff that I spoke to Chris about, like, if developing a high level of strength isn't like a be all and end all, but if you're lacking in a high level of strength, you're probably lacking in your ability to really recruit those fast twitch, high threshold motor units. So if you've got a poor level of strength development, doing a lot of loaded jumps probably isn't actually going to be enough of a stimulus to really increase that level of motor unit recruitment. It just isn't going to be. If you've got someone who already has a high base level of strength, then they probably do have the ability to tap into those high threshold motor units and actually begin to create an adaptation around being able to tap into more and more of those higher thresholds, essentially. But if you haven't got that, all the loaded jumps in the world, probably it will help you develop that to a degree, but it's a poor tool to utilize. You'd be much better going probably a block of strength work to just develop your ability to generate high levels of force before maybe then trying to look at that further down the line.
Do you have any general standards then you like to adhere to if someone is stronger?
I tend to use force plates a lot for my initial testing and profiling. It varies person to person, but for a lot of my MMA guys in particular, I'll really look to try and go over like a 4 times bodyweight mid-thigh pull. I think if any of those guys are under a 4 times bodyweight mid-thigh, then strength is definitely a big part of what I'm trying to develop. Not because I think it's mandatory for them to be over 4, but I think their ability to then
There's juice left to squeeze.
Yeah, their ability to then start to transfer some of that into power, speed, we're going to be limited by their inability to tap into those high threshold motor units. Unless obviously someone is very strong, but they're just carrying a load of weight because they're off camp, then that might change a bit. But
yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, and that's I guess for people who don't have force plates and stuff, I guess we could go by like the general standards of like 1.5 to 2x, 2x body weight squat kind of thing, 2 to 2.5 body weight. It's tough when you're giving strength standards on just basic lifts because there's a skill component to it. On top of that, it's kind of like just because you squat that much, does that really matter versus the actual force output you're generating doing other things? But just, I guess for people who don't have that, that could be something to go by.
Yeah, 100%. I think if you in one of the gyms that I work at, I'm fortunate enough that I have force plates there and I keep them there. And in one of the other gyms, one of the MMA gyms, I don't have force plates. Sometimes I'll take them with me, but when I do a lot of testing for some of the MMA fighters there, I kind of revert back to your standard like hex bar deadlift, percentage body weight. I think that the challenge with going off any of your like 3 rep max, 5 rep max is there's a huge coordinative element that is going to influence that. Just how well you can actually squat is going to influence massively. Like anybody knows your ability to express force in that lift. So something like if someone gets over a 2.2 times hex bar because there's minimal skill involved in that, like I know they've got a decent level of strength.
Yeah.
And that's probably not going to be one of the lowest hanging fruit. There's going to be better things that we can spend our time on.
Nice. So there's probably fighters listening to this who are in similar situations where, maybe they only do have 2 hours per week for their strength and conditioning, like some of your guys do who come to you. What should they, I mean, obviously it's individual, but there'll be general things. What should they be focusing on in those sessions or in those 2 1-hour sessions that they have?
I think my first recommendation to any sort of fighter, and I've done a few kind of posts on this on my socials a little bit, is about actually like really trying to develop clarity on what you're using your strength and conditioning for, because I think it's really easy to be like, well, and I sometimes preach a little bit as well, but to go, come in the gym and lift something fast, lift something heavy, do some high reps in these high injury area. You know what I mean? Like just go in, do this, and this. But again, I always look at my MMA guys and I kind of look at the amount of training they do in the week. And I see some of them for 1-2 hours a week. And outside of that, they're doing 2-3 sessions a day, some days, 1 session a day, another. Like you've got all these competing elements of your program that are all trying to basically elicit an adaptation. So yes, we can come in and do some jumps and some throws and we can lift some heavy stuff and that's great, but you need to actually understand and be really clear on what you want your strength and conditioning to help you with. So that's kind of point 1, which is I'd never suggest to anyone just to come in and do lots of stuff for the sake of it. I know that sounds really simple to say, but really sit down and go, what's the priority in my programming? Is it that you do feel you're lacking just some foundational fundamental strength? Because if that's the case, then that should probably form the vast majority of your program. And yes, you might do some jumps or some throws in a very minimal dose at the start, and you might do some higher repetition, capacity, endurance type work at the end. But 70% of your session probably needs to be around that strength work, because that's kind of your rate limit that you've suggested to yourself. So that's point 1 for me. And then after that, it's basically building the program around it. So like I say, if you feel that power is your biggest weakness, then you need to be choosing exercises like we spoke before that are actually get you probably moving with intent and with some velocity, ideally that's quicker than movements you might do in the sport. If you recognize that it's a strength issue, then you need to go in and you need to be lifting some pretty considerable weight to try and improve that strength. You're probably not going to get strong after doing 12 rep, 15 rep maxes. You need to be lifting those heavy weights to try and improve that strength. If you sit and look at your program and go, actually, my conditioning is my biggest problem, then that should probably be reflected in your strength and conditioning session. Like maybe you don't need 2 strength sessions in the week. Maybe you need might be you need 2 conditioning. If you don't feel like your strength is an issue, your power is an issue, then dedicate that time to conditioning. But yeah, my biggest piece of advice, and that I kind of always recommend to anyone, is before you decide you're going to do 2 strength and conditioning sessions and start putting in exercises or looking at what exercise is best for this or this, just really sit down and figure out why you want to do that strength and conditioning in the first place and what's the priority of the session, and then work back from there, essentially.
Nice. Do you prescribe anything? Because obviously they're only with you for maybe a couple of hours a week. Do you prescribe anything for them to do maybe before or after technical training?
Yeah, I will try to, and it's really athlete dependent. Like some guys I could tell to do stuff and prescribe stuff, and that's one of the biggest differences between the private sector and pro sport, right? If I give guys stuff to do after training when I'm in GB Taekwondo, I stick my head in the door when training's finished. And I'm like, you with me.
Yeah.
But in private, I'm like saying, right, you do this, and kind of sitting there with my fingers crossed, hoping they do it. So I will try in some aspects if there are guys who have reasonably big injury histories or the areas that they have kind of chronic ongoing problems with, then I will try and kind of either give them some loading to do on those areas, maybe either before or after training, or additionally, it might be some conditioning kind of bolt-on type work, again, before or after training. But the majority, particularly if it's relating to kind of some injury mitigation work or some loading that's hopefully going to offset their chance of in the future, I'll try and do that in the session with me so that I can make sure it is of the appropriate loading. You know, they are performing the movements that I need them to do correctly. Generally, it's probably conditioning or maybe grip circuits or calf circuits or those type of things I might give them to do after training, which if they don't do, isn't the end of the world, because hopefully in the sessions with me, we're doing all the big important stuff anyway.
Yeah. How are you programming the conditioning? So they're with you with 2 1-hour sessions. It seems like the strength power stuff is probably the most important stuff you're working on in those sessions. So the conditioning then you're prescribing for them to do outside, maybe after the technical trainings?
Yeah, basically. So within the sessions with me, I don't really do any conditioning at all. I think I want to try and, again, coming back to being really clear on what the purpose of that session is, I want to try and have as little competing input for adaptation as possible, because, hey, this is just 2 hours. In some cases, guys that I see once a week, like, this is just 1 hour of 16 hours you're going to do this week. So I need to get as much as I can from this hour to try and help improve your power, your strength, whatever it is they're kind of with me for. So the conditioning work is probably the stuff that I give them to do externally. And it depends. I've played some of the guys that I work with and the girls that I work with, I've just sort of got to know a little bit through spending a lot of time with them, kind of watching them. I'm quite fortunate that particularly at one of the MMA gyms I'm at, the timings that I coach some of their guys, they're matched with the timings where some of them are on the mat, and also sometimes where sparring's going on. So I can actually see a bit of eyes on some sparring, but some of it comes from just getting to know them and watching them training and having conversations with them. Others I'll do some kind of energy system profiling with to develop a better understanding of sort of where they sit. And then I'm kind of programming the conditioning from there, basically. I'll tend to, particularly again with a lot of the MMA guys that I work with, bias a lot towards some of the lower intensity conditioning. Now, it's not because I think that some of the higher intensity stuff probably wouldn't elicit maybe some of the same changes in them. And like one of the big eye-opening things for me was one of your podcasts actually with Andrew Usher.
Sort of, that's probably one of the more popular ones.
Yeah, I can understand why as well. But that sort of opened my eyes to kind of a bit of a different way of thinking to what I was doing. But I think for a lot of the MMA guys, particularly in the gyms that I work with, because of the volumes and sessions and stuff they're doing a day, I've kind of found that if I sprinkle a little bit too much high intensity in there, they're just cooked. Like they just seem to overcook themselves, because again, it's not pro sport. I haven't got full say into their schedule. Like they might have a JIT session the following day, but really no one's too sure if that's an intense day, if they're just doing some tech work, if they're doing rounds, if they're just doing loads of lives. Like no one's probably too sure until they turn up on the day. So I am probably a little cautious with the conditioning I give them. I'll try and do a lot of off-beat, lower intensity work. and then only start to change that and kind of increase the intensity and go to probably some more of like your higher intensity intervals or your alactic kind of glycolytic work if some of the feedback they're giving me feels like it warrants that. If they're sort of saying that, you know, that they're feeling the recovery is good, but actually they're just not able to work at the intensity that they want to, or like my shoulders are really burning out as I start to kind of throw some of these striking exchanges, then I might kind of change my conditioning approach. But generally I'll go pretty low level, low intensity with my conditioning and hope that they just get enough from everywhere else within the chaos of the sporting environment that really helps. It's interesting as well. There's other, I say that with my MMA fighters, but with some of the boxers I work with, and this was the case with Lawrence actually, was his boxing coach has a very set conditioning model that he follows. And I think this is where it's quite important in the private sector to, one of the big things that I probably learned quite quickly, is kind of understand your role in the team. So for some of my boxers, their boxing coach has a very set conditioning model that they follow. And like this guy, Joe Gallagher's produced, what is it now? It's like 7 world champions come out of his gym. So I'd be a bit of a fool. I'd be a bit of a fool to sort of sit there and go, I don't know if I agree with this model. Like it clearly is working. It's doing stuff for his guys. So with them, I'm actually very hands off on the conditioning. And if anything, I'm probably structuring a lot of my strength sessions
around what's happening there.
Yeah, to try and support the conditioning that I know he has them doing. So that's another side of it, which I think in the private sector is just every there's no kind of probably conditioning. At GB Taekwondo, we had a bit of a conditioning model, which is like, hey, this is what we do with our guys. So I think now in the private sector, it's like, well, this is what I do with this person because I know they go to this gym and do this, and this is what I do with this person because they actually go to this gym and do this and this. So yeah, I probably have less of a model now and more of a like slightly individualized, slightly general model that I can kind of fluctuate between some of the fighters I work with.
Yeah, that makes sense as well. You mentioned energy system profiling. What are you doing there?
So I've kind of taken a lot of inspiration from sort of Gareth Sanford's work. And now I used to kind of go down the approach of, I do some like alactic, maybe 6-10 seconds, like power output on a watt bike. I then might do like a 30-second wing gait, look at their anaerobic glycolytic, and then do a like aerobic test on the watt bike as well. Like I'd use the watt bike maximal ramp and take it as this idea of, well, I've got their alactic, I've got their glycolytic, and I've got their aerobic, and based off my conversations with athlete and coach, I'm going to kind of pick which one we're trying to focus to improve a little bit if there isn't any glaring weak areas and focus on that. But utilizing Gareth's work a little bit more, and now just again kind of polarize it. I'll do sort of a few 6-second max effort sprints on a watt bike still, because I don't have sort of access to a track, and I don't really like doing that testing on a treadmill. It doesn't work very well. So I'll do it on a watt bike, look at kind of their like a 3-second average or their highest 3-second average power output on the watt bike. And then I'll get them to do a 6-minute just max effort aerobic. And I'll start to kind of plot almost like their speed reserve, but I know because it's on a bike, it's power reserve. And I just started to do that with some of the guys that I work with. And over time, I've kind of built up a bit of profile of lots of different fighters that I work with. And then from that now helps me kind of guide some of the duration of intervals and the amount of the actual volume I might give of a certain conditioning stimulus to try and create that change. So if I've got some guys who have quite a low like power reserve, essentially, I'll make sure that a lot of their aerobic intervals are much shorter in nature because they're probably, again, going off some of the stuff Gareth talks about, like they're going to build up higher levels of lactate and hydrogen ions a little bit quicker. So if you start trying to do long aerobic intervals with them, they're probably going to like blow their legs off pretty soon, and it's not going to be the aerobic session you want it to be. Whereas the guys who have a much greater ratio of kind of aerobic to alactic, I'll do much longer intervals and again use that to play into their strengths a bit. If I've got some guys who have actually quite probably a smaller ratio between their like alactic versus their aerobic, so probably more biased to being an alactic, quite fast twitch athlete. I actually probably bias more conditioning at times now towards those higher intensity intervals, because I'm kind of, my thinking behind it is I'm giving them what they're good at and probably what got them to this point in the first place. So it's still a bit raw with how I'm probably doing it, and the more data I can collect from guys, the better. But it's just kind of a slowly evolving system.
No, I like the model. It gives you stuff to work from. Are you trying to change that power reserve at all, or is that just for you to kind of see where they fit as a profiling standpoint to what you're going to, I guess, what you're going to prescribe them conditioning wise?
I kind of both, really. So I'll mainly use it as a bit of a tool to help me understand what I'm going to prescribe conditioning wise, particularly because, going back to my point earlier with some of the MMA guys, my bias towards lower intensity, more aerobic based conditioning, for anyone who is probably a more predominant fast twitch athlete, it's really going to influence the kind of work to rest ratios and the timings I'm giving them for that aerobic conditioning to make sure it stays at a lower intensity and it doesn't start to build up and cook them and then influence the rest of the week. But I also kind of use it as a bit of a conversation starter with them or with coaches, just as to talking about, well, let's say we have someone who actually has quite a large gap between their like aerobic kind of power, like where they are aerobically, and then they're like alactic top end. If they are probably more fast twitch biased, it might be a conversation with the coach and athlete, which is, do we want to play into this? Like, do we want to build this super strength a little bit, or actually do we need to try and improve your recoverability to a degree? Do we need to try and increase that aerobic fitness so hopefully you can still continue to operate at this intensity that you do, but you can just recover from it quicker? And vice versa with the more aerobic guys, like, are we just trying to play more into your superpower of work, or are we missing some intensity somewhere that we need to change? And it's a bit of a conversation starter as well.
Nice. Andrew Usher is actually listening in on the podcast currently. He says
there might be a lot of stuff he's sat there listening going, don't know. But yeah.
He says, can spread it though with MMA guys. I don't know which part of the conversation, Andrew, you're referring to. Maybe let us know. I'm assuming about maybe the high intensity conditioning stuff. But also wanted to ask you as well around the biggest problems, I guess, fighters are facing when they come to you. So you have a lot of guys in the professional area, and they probably have many coaches before and stuff like that too, but they're coming to you for a reason, and it's probably because they feel like they're lacking something or they need something. So are there common problems around a lot of these fighters are facing when they come to you?
Good question. I'd say yes, in a way. I think the vast majority, it's interesting. I think when I sit down with the vast majority of fighters, the biggest thing I hear from them is like, I feel like I want to be stronger. I'm not strong enough. But very rarely, I would say, is that actually the case. I think it's something that psychologically, a lot of fighters kind of have this thing of like, I want to be stronger, you know, I need to be stronger. But it's always quite interesting the amount of guys that I do profile and I kind of step away from them like, actually, your levels of force production are really, really good. So you feel you're lacking strength. Any profiling we've done shows different. Actually, what is strong to you? Like the biggest things, and this is where it can be a bit on us as the practitioner to try and unpick it a lot, is, you know, your classic things of, like I've said, I'm not strong enough, or I'm just afraid of gassing out. Like, particularly for the MMA guys, I think a lot of them, if I was to ask them, like, on fight night, what's your biggest fear? Like, for a lot of them, I think they would say gassing out, as opposed to almost being knocked out. Like, they just don't want to gas out and end those fights at all. So it's either just that classic thing of I'm not fit enough or I'm not strong enough. Those are the two general things. But like I say, very rarely when I go through any profiling, do any of those things, as far as with me, with my S&C hat on, are concerned, none of those are really true. So it's then sitting down and unpacking, like, well, what do you mean by strong? Like,
yeah, what have you found out what they're kind of referring to in that instance?
It really varies. So there's been a couple of boxers where for them strong is like, if someone's closing the distance and I'm going to like try and hit them with my jab, I want to stop them there and then. Like, that's what strong is to them. And then it's interesting for me as an S&C coach, because I'm like, cool, that's not strong to me. That's not a strength attribute to me. That's almost like a speed or a power. To the MMA guys, it's to be able to, take down fence if they're against the cage, or just be able to, similarly, like when they're hitting these guys, feel like it is really doing some damage, or these guys are feeling it. So quite often or my own perception from the group that I work with, is when they talk about strong, they don't mean strong in the sense that we do with an S&C hat on. They'll often mean more down the route of, I want to be powerful. But equally, I've kind of found there's a huge psychological element. I think a lot of them want to be strong because or feel that they want to improve their strength because they want to feel a bit more alpha. They want to walk into the ring feeling like they are the stronger one, and that is purely the reason they want to get strong. It's this psychological element for them.
That's why you train arms.
Precise. Yeah, there's lots of reasons to train arms, but one of them is so that you look good in your like your shirt when you're walking out.
Andrew actually just commented now. He's saying RPM is potentially a better indicator for internal workload and power for external on bike. And I think you've got a paper coming out soon with that, I think. And he should be studying for his damn PhD defense anyway. He's obviously procrastinating now.
If there is a paper, like I say, it'd be really interesting to read, because it was one of the things that after your podcast with Andrew, it challenged a lot of what I was doing. I think would I say it probably changed a lot? No, and that's probably down to my own natural. I'll hold my hands up, that's down to my own natural biases. But it really got me rethinking a lot about the impact of like high intensity conditioning. And I think if I had someone who was on a really short turnaround, like really quick turnaround, then I'd be all over the high intensity stuff. But like I say, because a lot of the guys I tend to work with, the pros, we tend to have much longer for their camp. So I feel I can probably get away with the lower intensity model a little bit more because we've got time on our hands, essentially.
Yeah, fair enough.
Whether that's right or wrong, I'm sure she'll disagree. But
because you mainly have boxers and MMA athletes in your care. Does training philosophy differ much between them in terms of maybe just the strength training side?
Yeah, it does. I think there's a few things that I'll do quite differently for my boxers than I will for my MMA guys. I think for boxers, there's less of an influence in my eyes on maximal force. There's definitely, I think the threshold that like maximal force production can influence their sporting environment is much, much lower. Also, there's kind of the actual exercises that I might prescribe. Like I'll do a lot more kind of reduced range of motion lifts for some of the boxers than I would do the MMA guys. Oh, have you got me?
No, I've got
perfect.
you.
Yeah, it cut off for a second on mine. I'll do a lot more reduced range of motion lifts for the boxers than I will do the MMA guys, just because of the kind of the ranges of motion that they're operating in when they're in the ring. They don't need to be producing force in a lot of real deep hip and knee positions. Essentially, they don't need to be in like deep knee flexion, deep hip flexion. That isn't kind of the environment that they're in. So I'll do a lot more reduced range of motion work for them as opposed to MMA guys. And then particularly with the boxers that I work with, because a lot of them are kind of sent to me from Joe. And I know that he has like I say, he has almost a conditioning system that he puts them in based off how far they are from their fight. And that involves a lot of running, a lot of track work, a lot of road work. Particularly for my boxers, I'll go very heavy on kind of foot and ankle with regards to strength. Like we'll do a lot of really, really heavy, like calf raises, like sets of 5, almost like treating it like we might do a normal compound lift that we would have in the gym. Again, really heavy tib work, a lot of like inversion, eversion work. I'll go really kind of into that foot and ankle because I know there's loads and loads of road work that they're going to have to tolerate. Whereas with the MMA guys, they tend to do a lot less road work, a lot less road running, but things like neck might become a problem from a lot of the jits and the wrestling and just trying to have postures broken and forearms and stuff as well. So there are definitely carryovers between the two, but probably the ratios of strength to almost like power and high velocity work of the MMA guys is different to the boxers. I'll probably go more power and high velocity work with the boxers who already have a good level of strength, as opposed to the MMA guys who they might always have a slightly smaller amount of power and higher velocity work in there and more strength-based work, unless they already have a really high relative strength, and then that might change slightly.
Nice. We actually have a question in the chat too about how do you tackle mobility for the different fighters? I would assume a fighter with a striking background got less mobility on the ground and vice versa, say wrestlers and kicks.
I think firstly for me, yeah, it's understanding if it's a problem. I think there's quite a tendency, and this was something mainly from Taekwondo actually that I saw that I've carried with me for a while, is you would hear some of the Taekwondo guys in particular talk about like, I want to be more flexible. But if you actually speak to the coach, speak to them and be like, do you need to, I know you want to be more flexible. Fine, you want to be more flexible, but do you need to be like, is there any part of your technical game that you can't improve or that you can't do because of your current flexibility? And quite frequently the answer is no. So it's often the almost want to improve mobility was the fact they couldn't do a full, like split stretch or a full box kind of split, basically. It was almost driven more by the fact that when they were stretching off at the end of the session, they were limited and they couldn't do a full stretch as opposed to anything technical. And then, so I carry that approach with me a lot with the MMA guys and the box in particular, which is like, if they talk about being like wanting to improve mobility and stuff, I kind of really want to make sure that one, that is actually what they need. Particularly for the MMA guys, if it's to do with anything like jits related or wrestling related and it's something at the hips, my biggest thing first off is, well, whatever that lack of mobility that you feel you have and whatever position you're being exposed to where that's a problem in your jits training, for example, like you need to just go and drill that loads. Like we can do loads of mobility work in the gym in theory, but specific adaptation to imposed demands. Like you need to go do the thing that's causing you the problem to improve it. And then it'll be, if there's issues through the hips, I'll really try and I won't do much stretching. I don't really do a lot of mobility work in the warm-up or give them a lot of mobility work. I'll just really try and expose them to load in those ranges that are causing the problem. So find a way to progressively overload the issues through the hips that they're having, whether if it's like internal or external rotation, or whatever it might be. Like I won't go down the stretching or mobility route. Like my warm-ups are pretty short. I don't have guys do much mobility at the end of the session. In fact, I don't do any. It's a case of finding a way that we can progressively overload that area in longer muscle length positions and running with that, whilst the key messaging is still, you need to go and drill it. Like you just need to go do it, because we can do all this, but it's still not quite that.
Yeah, it's funny enough, the loosest my hips have ever been was when we're drilling triangles all the damn time, triangle chokes, and then my hips, like, they were like, I could actually get into position super easy. Now I haven't been drilling that stuff a lot. It's just like, they're back to normal. so like you mentioned, right, you got to actually do the stuff.
Yeah, and that's I think a thing that sometimes it can be quite easy to get away from a little bit, which is like, particularly in the private sector, because there's this kind of underarching thing of like, this person is paying me to help them. It's not, again, coming back to pro sport versus private. In pro sport, the athlete has to work for me because I'm the S&C coach there. Like you kind of got, I'm sure if they kicked off enough, you could go elsewhere, but like I am your S&C coach at tomorrow. In the private sector, like this person is paying you to help them. So there can be this want to have this knee-jerk reaction if someone comes in and says, you know what, my thoracic spine's feeling really tight at the minute. Can we do a bit of work on that today? Like the knee-jerk reaction to be like, cool, yeah, let's do it. But again, coming back to what I said at the start about like clarity of the training session is like, one, is this just a short-term thing that maybe you just give them a few kind of movements to do at home, a few cat-cows or whatever, or like, is it a long-term thing we actually need to dedicate time to, and is it a genuine problem?
Probably something you could also just throw in between like supersets of, I don't know, some kind of strength exercise, right? Just to kind of tick the box.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't do that. I'm quite down the road of, if I've, again, it's something from some of my conversations with Chris, which is a lot of my kind of strength work in the gym or anything I'm using to try and develop power or develop force, like I won't really superset with anything, particularly a lot of the strength work, because I want as little kind of space being taken up in the brain and the motor command by anything else.
Mm.
I kind of want all that attention to be, if we've got 3 sets of 5 to try and improve some lower body maximal force, like I really want to try and maximize that, because again, I might only have you twice a week or even once a week. So if there's little mobility based stuff that we feel we need to do, let's find somewhere else in the session it makes more sense to do it. I don't tend to do a lot of, my programs are pretty boring, I'll put it that way. I don't tend to do a lot of supersets. Like, if you look at it on paper, it's like,
right?
boring. Yeah, well, I'd like to think so. I'm biased.
That's the thing, right? Because people can get sold on what's happening on social media with fancy routines, and you see a lot of people doing like sprint drills and stuff as part of like fighters trainings and stuff, and you're sitting there like, man, like that just looks like such a waste of time where you could be doing something else.
Yeah,
but, you know, like
warm-ups are a big pet peeve for me. Like they're a big one where I'll see, and again, socials, and you see stuff in other gyms, it's always, you've got to take a pinch of salt because you don't know the context around it. But you know, I come back to my environment. Like I see some of the guys that I work with for an hour a week, like some of the pros who are slightly lower level at the minute probably would want to work with me twice a week, but probably can't afford to. So although I might give them programs to do outside, the actual hands-on time I have with them once a week is probably an hour. It's like, I can spend 15, 20 minutes with you doing all these like banded crab walks and like all this stuff. Or, you know, you can come in, we can do like a little circuit of just 2 or 3 exercises to get some blood flowing and kind of increase muscle temperature. And then, I don't know, we're starting with some jumps. Let's do a set of sub-max jumps and then we're into it.
Yeah.
And it's like, you don't need all that warm-up stuff that comes before. Like, what's the point? You're probably the first exercise you're going to do, you can do a warm-up set of anyway. So what's that for, basically?
Yeah, that's how I've always done it too. Back remember when I had 30 or 40 players, you would go, my warm-up would always be 3 exercises. It's either maybe addressing common injury areas or putting something in there that they're not going to get from the main program. Because if you're only lifting twice a week, you're going to miss stuff. So you might do some of your extensive plyometrics and stuff in that time and do it in a circuit fashion, get the heart rate up, get warm. Again, then you can just, as I mentioned, then you can just go straight into the first exercise once you've done that. Instead of spending all this time doing band this, band that, you know, whatever the hell else people are doing, or 5 minutes of foam rolling before that. So now you're already 10 minutes into the session. You haven't even started.
Yeah. I have some exercises in my warm-up that I just have guys do no matter what. Like, they never change, because again, sometimes the other challenge in the private sector is timekeeping, right? Because this is sometimes where I think the challenge, it can also be another challenge, which is if I've got Lawrence in the gym with me and we're 2 weeks out from his like world title fight and he's come in 10 minutes late, but I know we've got to get this stuff done. When the next athlete's coming in after him, like if he knows his warm-up like the back of his hand and he's been doing it for a year, basically just the exact same warm-up, I can have him start cracking on with his warm-up whilst I finish off this really important stuff that I need to finish off.
That's a good point.
With Lawrence. And that's, so I kind of keep my warm-ups very samey, very short, very sweet, because I also want this level of autonomy where I am open in the fact that I work hour to hour to hour to hour. And if someone is overrunning a little bit and it is an important person, like I kind of need whoever's coming to the gym to not just sit there and wait. I kind of almost need to get to them 5-10 minutes late whilst it's not ideal, but then be ready to go. So yeah, that's why I'm even not a fan of loads of extra additional like fluffy warm-up stuff, because logistically it makes my life easier as well.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I think that's everything I wanted to cover with you today, James. Where do you want to send people to follow you and see what you're doing? I see you've got 10K followers on Instagram now.
Yeah. So I made a real push. When was it? It must have been around July, August time last year. I made a real push, which like, I'm going to spend some time getting stuff into my socials. And yeah, I didn't. It sort of paid off. Played around with a few like ads and stuff like everybody does. But yeah, hit 10K, which I was pretty chuffed about. Because ultimately, like we were saying off air before, that tends to be for a lot of us guys in the private sector where business comes from. So if that keeps growing, then I'm a happy man. It means kind of something's going right, or a lot of people hate me. One of the two. Yeah.
What's your handle? What do they search?
So it's JL Performance Coach. Literally the initials JL and then Performance Coach. And Instagram's pretty much the primary one that I use. I've got a Twitter. I never put anything on it. But Instagram probably where all my business stuff goes. Any any kind of snapshots of like athletes I'm working with, or anything that's kind of on my mind training wise, that's where all that goes anyway. So that's probably the best place to see anything I'm doing, and also to reach me.
Perfect. I'll link that in the description. I won't forget that one. So that'll be there for anyone to go click on. But I appreciate you coming on, James.
No, mate, it was good to catch up after 2 years. So
Yeah.
it's always good to talk shop.
Perfect.